The desert wind howled through the canyons, carrying the scent of dust and blood. The moon cast long shadows across the empty Texas plains, the vast landscape stretching endlessly into the night. Out here, there were no neighbors, no cops, no one to hear you scream. And that's exactly why the Martinez cartel had chosen this place. The convoy of black SUVs crawled to a stop at the edge of Cade Ranch, headlights flickering against the barbed wire fence. The men inside moved with practiced ease, their silenced rifles tucked close to their chests, black combat gear blending into the night. They weren't amateurs, they were trained killers, enforcers for one of the most ruthless cartels in Mexico. Their mission was simple: eliminate the landowner, take over the ranch, and establish a smuggling pipeline into Texas. They thought this was just another farm. They thought the owner was just another rancher. They had no idea they were walking into hell. The leader of the crew, Mateo Garcia, stepped out first. He was lean, sharp-eyed, and cruel, the kind of man who had killed more people than he could count. He adjusted the suppressor on his pistol, glancing at the farmhouse. "Quiet," he muttered. The others fanned out, moving like shadows, their boots crunching softly against the dirt. "He's probably asleep," one of the men whispered. Garcia smirked. Not for long. They scaled the fence, their movement swift and controlled. Within seconds, they were inside the property, creeping toward the house like wolves closing in on their prey. They reached the porch. Garcia raised his fist, signaling silence. Then he nodded to the two men at the front. One of them tried the doorknob. It was unlocked. They exchanged glances. Too easy. The first enforcer stepped inside, his rifle sweeping the darkened hallway. Then, the lights snapped on. And they realized they had just made the worst mistake of their lives. A silenced rifle round punched through the first enforcer's forehead before he could even react, his body slumping against the wall like a puppet with its strings cut. Garcia barely had time to register what was happening before a shotgun blast ripped through the chest of the second man, throwing him backward through the screen door, his body convulsing on the porch. "Mierda!" Garcia cursed, diving for cover as gunfire erupted from the shadows. They had walked into a trap. A voice as cold as death echoed from the hall. "You boys lost?" Garcia's blood ran cold. The owner of this ranch wasn't some helpless old farmer. He was John Cade, a man whose name was spoken in whispers in the darkest corners of the intelligence world. A man who had killed presidents, dictators, and terrorists in places that didn't officially exist. A man who had once been the most feared assassin in the U.S. Black Ops Division, and now he was hunting them. Garcia scrambled back toward the yard, barking orders into his radio. "Es una trampa! Salgan de aquí! It's a trap! Get the hell out of here!" But it was too late. Cade moved through the house like a ghost, his steps calculated, his rifle firing in quick, precise bursts. Another enforcer tried to make a break for it, racing toward the back door. Cade put a round through his kneecap. The man collapsed, screaming. Outside, the cartel reinforcements tried regrouping, forming a defensive line behind their SUVs. One of them raised an RPG, aiming at the house. Before he could fire, a single bullet tore through his skull, his body dropping like a stone. Jim Torres had taken position on the water tower, his suppressed sniper rifle sending death from above. Another enforcer sprinted toward one of the trucks, trying to radio for backup. A tripwire exploded beneath his feet, sending him flying into the night, his body landing in the dirt in pieces. Garcia crawled behind the burning SUV, panting, his heart pounding. This wasn't a firefight. This was a massacre, and Cade was just getting started. Garcia was alone now. His men were dead or dying, their screams echoing through the night. The smell of gunpowder and blood filled the air. He pressed himself against the charred remains of the truck, sweat rolling down his face, his breathing ragged. Then, the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, unhurried. Garcia swallowed hard, gripping his pistol with shaking hands. A shadow moved just beyond the flickering firelight. Then, John Cade stepped into view. His rifle was slung over his shoulder now, his combat knife glinting in the firelight. His eyes were calm, cold, merciless. Garcia raised his pistol, hands trembling. Cade didn't flinch. "You killed my men," Garcia spat, his voice shaking. Cade tilted his head. "You killed yourself the moment you stepped onto my land." Garcia screamed and fired. Cade moved like a specter, sidestepping the shot, closing the distance in a blink. Before Garcia could react, Cade's knife was in his gut, twisting. Garcia choked, gasping, his body jerking violently. Cade leaned in close, whispering in his ear, "Tell the devil I sent you." Then he ripped the blade free. Garcia collapsed, dead before he hit the ground. Cade stood over the bodies, breathing slow, steady, unshaken. The desert was silent again. Bear, his massive Belgian Malinois, trotted up beside him, sniffing the corpses before sitting at his feet. Cade looked down at his blood-stained knife, then back at the burning wreckage. He knew what this meant. The cartel would come, and when they did, he'd be waiting. Cade reached down, grabbed the cartel's radio from Garcia's corpse, and switched to their private frequency. Static crackled. Then, a voice. "Garcia, are you there?" Cade pressed the button, his voice calm, deadly. "Send more men?" Then, he dropped the radio, turned, and disappeared into the darkness. The bodies were already buried by sunrise. John Cade worked in silence, his hands steady as he dug into the hard Texas dirt. The sun had yet to climb above the ridgeline, but sweat still slicked his back, his muscles aching from the long night behind him. He wasn't sentimental about the dead, especially not cartel enforcers, but he didn't leave bodies out for the coyotes either. That kind of mess invited attention. By the time he had finished, the remains of the men who had tried to take his ranch were deep underground, along with their weapons and their sins. The only sign they had ever existed was the charred wreckage of their SUVs, still smoldering on the edge of his property. Bear sat by the graves, his ears twitching, his body still tense. He could sense it, just like Cade could. This wasn't over. Cade wiped the sweat from his brow and turned his eyes toward the horizon. He had spent decades tracking enemies, watching their patterns, predicting their next move before they even made it. The cartel wasn't going to let this go, not after last night. A man like Santos Martinez, the cartel boss pulling the strings, didn't build his empire by letting a ghost from the past tear it apart. And Cade had just sent a message the old-fashioned way. Through blood and fire, they were coming, and they'd be bringing hell with them. Cade took a slow breath and headed back toward the house. It was time to prepare for war. The first sign of trouble came that afternoon. Cade had been setting up his next line of defenses, reinforcing the barn, restocking ammunition, making sure every blind spot on the property was covered. He had just finished checking the tripwires along the southern ridge when he heard it, the hum of an approaching drone. He looked up. It was a small one, civilian grade, hovering just above the treetops, its tiny camera swiveling toward him. Cade exhaled through his nose. The cartel was scouting. He reached down to his belt, pulled his 1911 pistol, and fired one clean shot. The bullet ripped through the drone's body, sending it spiraling to the ground in a smoking heap. A message of his own. He didn't need to track where it had come from. He already knew. The cartel was setting up outside his land, staging themselves just beyond the ridge where his property line ended, close enough to strike, but far enough to make it look like they were waiting. They wanted him to run. Cade didn't run. The first bullet came at midnight. Cade had been waiting, crouched low inside the barn's upper loft, rifle steady against the wooden beams, eyes fixed on the shadows moving along the ridgeline. They came in fast and quiet, dressed in black, their movements precise. Ex-military, not cartel thugs this time. These were mercenaries, hired guns brought in to do what the first group couldn't. Cade let them move in. There were 8 of them, moving in a staggered line, rifles sweeping left and right. He tracked their lead man, a tall bastard with a tactical vest, suppressed MP5 in hand, scanning the property like he was moving through a war zone. He wasn't wrong. The first enforcer signaled the others forward. Cade exhaled, and then he fired. The .308 round punched through the first man's skull, dropping him instantly. His body crumpled without a sound, blood pooling into the dry dirt. The others froze, their instincts kicking in, turning toward the sound, but Cade was already relocating, rolling onto his stomach, shifting position before they could zero in on him. One of them whispered into his radio, "Contacto." Cade smirked. "No shit, amigo." The next shot blew apart another enforcer's chest, sending him sprawling into the dirt. The cartel fired back blindly, their rounds peppering the barn, but Cade was already gone. The mercenaries regrouped, moving in pairs, sweeping toward the barn's entrance. Cade watched them move, their pattern predictable, disciplined. But discipline only worked when you knew the battlefield. Cade knew it better than they did. He triggered the first claymore. The explosion ripped through the night, flames swallowing 2 more men, their bodies torn apart by the blast. The rest of them scattered, cursing in Spanish, one of them screaming into the radio. Cade heard him calling for reinforcements, his voice shaking. Panic. Good! Cade slung his rifle over his shoulder, grabbed his shotgun, and slipped out the back of the barn. They wanted to hunt him? Now they were the ones being hunted. The last 2 mercenaries tried to retreat. Cade let them think they were getting away. One of them made it to the fence line, his breath ragged, his rifle shaking in his grip. He turned back to find his partner, but the other one was gone. Just gone. The only thing left was the whisper of the wind and the distant howling of coyotes. The remaining man whimpered, his hands slick with sweat. He turned in a slow circle, rifle raised, breath hitching. That's when Cade stepped out of the shadows. The mercenary barely had time to blink before Cade's knife buried itself into his throat. The man gurgled, choking on his own blood as Cade lowered him to the ground, silent, efficient, precise. It was over. Cade wiped the blade clean and looked toward the horizon. They were testing him, seeing how strong he was. But he wasn't just strong, he was the last mistake they'd ever make. At dawn, Cade sent his own message. He loaded the bodies into one of the SUVs the cartel had left behind, then drove it right up to the edge of the ridgeline, where the cartel was hiding. He got out, standing in the open, his rifle slung over his shoulder. He knew they were watching. He popped the SUV's trunk and let the bodies spill out onto the dirt. Then he pulled a flare from his pocket, lit it, and tossed it onto the vehicle's hood. The fire caught fast, swallowing the truck, the corpses, the evidence. He turned and walked away, never once looking back. Behind him, the flames roared into the sky. The cartel thought they were at war with a lone rancher. Now they knew the truth. They were at war with a ghost. And ghosts don't die easy. The fire burned through the night, a beacon of defiance that could be seen from miles away. John Cade had sent his message, loud and clear. The cartel had lost another squad. Their men were dead, their truck in flames, their plans unraveling, and Cade had walked away without a scratch. But the war wasn't over. It was just beginning. By sunrise, Cade was already moving. He had spent the night preparing, fortifying, setting the next stage. His land wasn't just a ranch anymore, it was a battlefield. Every blind spot had been eliminated, every approach funneled into kill zones, every structure reinforced. The barn was now a last stand bunker, with ammo caches hidden in walls and tripwires waiting for the first idiot who thought he could take Cade by surprise. He wasn't just defending his home, he was making it a graveyard. Bear trotted beside him as Cade surveyed the landscape, rifle slung across his chest. The desert stretched out in all directions, empty and endless. He knew they would come again, bigger, angrier, and armed to the teeth. And he was ready. The morning air was too still. He felt it in his gut, the kind of feeling he used to get on missions, right before a raid. It was instinct. A lifetime of war had trained his senses to recognize when something wasn't right. And then, the silence was broken. The distant thump, thump, thump of helicopter blades echoed over the hills. Cade turned, narrowing his eyes as a blacked-out MD-500 chopper crested the ridgeline. Its nose dipping low, scanning the land below. They had brought air support. Cade exhaled. This was going to be fun. The chopper hovered for a moment, then turned west, disappearing behind the hills. Scouting. They were looking for him, for his weaknesses, for a way in. That meant the ground team wasn't far behind. Cade headed back toward the house, moving quick, adrenaline settling into his veins like an old friend. He grabbed the bolt-action rifle he had pulled from the last cartel enforcer, checking the chamber. The scope was garbage, but it would do. He climbed onto the roof, crouching low, pressing the stock into his shoulder. The dust cloud in the distance told him all he needed to know. The convoy was coming. 3 trucks, maybe 4, more men than last time, at least 15 to 20, fully armed, ready for war. Cade took a deep breath, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. He had 4 rounds in the magazine. That meant 4 kills before they even knew what hit them. He sighted in on the lead truck, exhaled, and pulled the trigger. The driver's head snapped back, his skull splitting open as the windshield turned red. The truck veered left, tires screaming against the dirt, flipping onto its side, rolling twice before slamming into a boulder. The convoy erupted into chaos. Men leaped from their vehicles, shouting orders, trying to find cover, but there was nowhere safe. Cade adjusted his aim, fired again. The second bullet punched through the chest of a man stepping out of the passenger side, sending him sprawling into the dirt. The cartel soldiers scrambled, ducking behind vehicles, searching the ridgeline for the shooter. They still didn't know where he was. Cade moved quickly, rolling to his side, adjusting position before taking another shot. The third man went down with a round to the throat, clutching his neck, choking on his own blood. 3 shots, 3 kills. The remaining men found their bearings and unleashed hell, bullets ripping through the side of the house, the sound of automatic fire tearing through the morning stillness. Cade slid off the roof, landing softly on his feet. The house wasn't where he was going to fight them. It was a decoy. He moved toward the barn. He wanted them to follow. The first 2 cartel soldiers moved cautiously, approaching the porch, rifles raised, their boots crunching against the gravel. One of them kicked open the door, shouting in Spanish. Nothing. The house was empty. They moved inside, scanning the rooms, their fingers tight on their triggers. That's when the tripwire snapped. The shotgun rig mounted inside the doorframe fired a single blast, ripping the first enforcer apart, his body slamming into the wall, blood spraying across the floorboards. The second man had just enough time to turn before Cade burst through the back door, knife in hand, driving it deep into his ribs. The soldier gasped, shuddered, then collapsed as Cade yanked the blade free. 2 down, more coming. He grabbed a grenade from his belt, pulled the pin, and lobbed it through the window. The explosion rattled the entire house, sending flames licking through the doorway. Outside, the rest of the cartel soldiers ducked for cover, caught between advancing and realizing they had walked into another trap. Cade moved through the smoke, silent, patient, hunting. The cartel soldiers weren't soldiers, not really. They had guns, they had training, but they weren't killers like he was. They fought in numbers. They relied on fear, on overwhelming force. And right now, they were afraid. One of them, a younger man, stumbled away from the burning house, breathing hard, his hand shaking as he tried to reload his rifle. Cade grabbed him from behind, twisting his neck in a sharp snap. The body hit the dirt. The rest of the cartel soldiers were falling back, their leader shouting orders, but it didn't matter. They were done. They had lost. One by one, Cade cut them down, a bullet for each, moving like a shadow between the flames, until only one remained. The last enforcer, bleeding from a bullet wound in his leg, tried to crawl toward one of the trucks. He was gasping, desperate, broken. Cade walked up behind him, gripping his knife, his boots crunching against the dirt. The enforcer turned, eyes wide. "Please!" he choked out in Spanish. Cade crouched down, staring into the man's terrified face. "Where's Martinez?" The enforcer shook his head, still gasping, sweat dripping from his forehead. I don't know. He's coming." Cade nodded. "Good." Then he drove the knife into the man's throat. The body twitched once, then went still. Cade wiped the blade clean, exhaling through his nose. He knew what would come next. Martinez would hear about this. He would know Cade wasn't just a problem. He was a goddamn nightmare. And when the cartel boss finally came to clean up this mess himself, Cade would be waiting. The sun was sinking low, painting the desert in streaks of red and gold, but John Cade wasn't admiring the view. He stood over the last cartel enforcer's body, wiping the blood from his blade onto the dead man's shirt. The wind had shifted, carrying the lingering stench of gunpowder, sweat, and burnt flesh. The ground around him was littered with the corpses of the men sent to take his land. They were supposed to be killers. Instead, they had become prey. Bear sat beside him, panting lightly, his black fur matted with dust and streaks of blood. He had fought alongside Cade before, had ripped through cartel enforcers with the same unshakable instinct Cade had honed for years. The dog could feel it too. The fight wasn't over. Cade stepped away from the bodies, reloading his rifle with practiced hands. He had been running the numbers in his head. 20 men down, 4 trucks burned, 2 drones shot out of the sky. The Martinez cartel had lost more in the last 2 nights than they had in the last 2 years, and Santos Martinez wasn't going to let that stand. Cade grabbed the radio off the last enforcer, switching frequencies. Static crackled for a moment before a voice came through. "Garcia, are you there?" Cade smiled grimly and pressed the button. Not anymore. Silence, then a deep, slow exhale. A voice came through, calm, smooth. "So, you're the one causing all this trouble." Cade recognized the voice instantly. Santos Martinez. "You're losing men," Cade said. "Running out of trucks, running out of time." Martinez chuckled, but there was no amusement in it. "You think this is a victory?" His voice was dark, dangerous, filled with an arrogance Cade had heard before, from cartel leaders, corrupt warlords, men who thought power meant invincibility. Cade had killed all of them. Martinez continued, "You're alone, rancher. You might have been something once, but now, you're just one man." Cade wiped sweat from his brow and looked around at the bodies. One man's all it took. A pause. Then, in a cold, measured tone, Martinez said, "I'm coming myself, and I'm bringing everyone." The radio went dead. Cade tossed it onto one of the smoldering trucks and walked toward the house. Bear followed, his ears twitching at the distant rumble of thunder. Only it wasn't thunder. Cade knew what was coming. It was the sound of war. They came at dusk, rolling over the hills like a storm. Cade stood on the roof of the barn, rifle braced, watching as the cartel's army approached. 6 armored SUVs, 2 flatbed trucks loaded with gunmen, and 1 armored personnel carrier, its mounted machine gun glinting in the fading sunlight. Santos Martinez was done playing. Cade inhaled slowly, letting the desert air fill his lungs. His hands were steady, his heartbeat was slow, controlled, lethal. Inside the barn, everything was ready. Ammo, explosives, escape routes. Every approach had been turned into a death trap. Martinez's convoy slowed as it reached the outer fence. Cade watched as the men poured out, their weapons glinting in the firelight from the still-burning trucks left behind from the last assault. Martinez himself stepped out of the lead SUV, wearing a sleek black suit, a pistol holstered at his hip, a cigar burning between his fingers. He scanned the area, then turned toward his men. "Find him," he ordered. "Kill him." Cade exhaled and pulled the trigger. The first shot punched through the skull of a cartel gunman, sending him crashing into the dirt before he could even react. The second shot ripped through the chest of another enforcer, his body jerking violently before he collapsed. Chaos erupted. Gunfire lit up the night, cartel soldiers scrambling for cover, firing blindly into the shadows. But Cade wasn't in the shadows anymore. He was already moving. He slipped down from the barn roof, darting through the smoke, his rifle switching from sniper mode to close quarters combat. He moved like a ghost, his body blending into the landscape as he took calculated shots, every bullet finding a target. A cartel enforcer sprinted toward the barn, yelling orders into his radio. Cade stepped out from behind a wooden post, pressing the barrel of his rifle against the man's gut. The shot blew through his stomach, dropping him instantly. Another enforcer jumped out from behind the truck, spraying automatic fire. Cade rolled left, came up fast, and put 2 rounds into his throat. The rest of the cartel soldiers were losing control. They had come expecting a desperate old man clinging to his land. Instead, they had found a killer still in his prime. Martinez watched as his men fell one by one, his jaw tightening. This wasn't just another hit. This wasn't just another job. This was a goddamn war. He turned to his second in command. "Send in the heavy guns." The armored truck's turret roared to life, raining down bullets on the barn, tearing through wooden beams, kicking up dust and shrapnel. Cade dived for cover, rolling into the dirt, feeling the heat of bullets slicing past his head. The roof of the barn collapsed, flames licking the sky. For the first time that night, Cade felt the fight shifting. He needed to move. Now Cade sprinted toward the house, bullets ripping through the walls as the cartel pushed forward. Bear stayed close, moving like a shadow beside him. He ducked into the kitchen, grabbed the last remaining explosives from his stash, and rigged the house to blow. Then, he ran. By the time the cartel breached the door, Cade was already halfway to the ridge, sniper rifle slung over his back, a detonator in his hand. He turned once, saw Martinez step inside, and then Cade pressed the button. The house exploded in a fireball, shattering windows, sending Cartel soldiers flying. The shockwave rattled the night, flames consuming everything inside. Martinez staggered out, coughing, face burned, rage twisting his features. Cade raised his rifle and fired. The bullet tore through Martinez's chest, sending him stumbling back into the flames. The Cartel soldiers froze. Their boss was dead. The fight was over. Cade lowered his rifle, watching as the remaining men dropped their weapons and ran. By sunrise, the land was his again. Bloodied, burned, scarred, but still his. Bear trotted beside him as he walked through the smoking wreckage, his steps slow, steady, unshaken. It was finally over. And Cade, he was still standing,